Imagine waking up one morning to find deep tire marks carved straight across your lawn. Not once, not twice, but every single day. At first you think it's an accident, maybe someone missed a turn. But then you realize it isn't the mistake at all. It's deliberate. The same car, the same driver. A neighbor who believes rules don't apply to them. And the worst part? The HOA does nothing. Instead, they shrug it off, leaving you stuck with the damage, the frustration, and the growing sense that your own home is under siege. But what happens when a homeowner decides they've had enough? When frustration turns into strategy, and strategy into a plan so bold it borders on dangerous? This isn't just another neighborhood squabble. It's a battle of boundaries, control, and revenge. So, what would you do if someone treated your property like their personal shortcut?
At first glance, life in the neighborhood seemed almost picture perfect. The kind of place where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets, where driveways gleamed from weekly power washes, and where the rhythm of sprinklers at dusk gave the impression of order and peace. It was the sort of community people imagined when they saved for years just to move somewhere nice. And for a while, that's exactly what it felt like for Daniel and his family. Daniel wasn't flashy. He worked long hours, paid his dues, and found peace in the simple joys, tending to his flower beds on weekends, grilling with friends on summer evenings, and watching his kids ride their bikes along the winding cul-de-sacs without worry. Their modest but well-kept home had been more than just an investment. It was a symbol of stability. After years of renting, they finally had a place to call their own, nestled in a neighborhood where everyone waved politely when they passed. The HOA, on paper, seemed like a safeguard for that stability. Its mission, they were told, was to preserve property values and maintain community harmony. The promise was tempting. No broken fences, no peeling paint, no overgrown yards to drag down the neighborhood. Daniel had signed the papers without hesitation, convinced that a little oversight would be a small price to pay for living in a place where everything looked cared for. In those early months, things were calm. The HOA newsletters arrived in the mailbox with reminders about upcoming events and seasonal maintenance tips. The board members, often seen at community gatherings, gave off the impression of friendly guardians of order. Daniel didn't think much about it. He was too busy balancing work and family life. For him, the HOA was background noise, another part of suburban living he hardly noticed. But beneath the veneer of harmony, small cracks were forming. Little things Daniel brushed off at first. A passive-aggressive note left on his doorstep about the color of his garden mulch. A warning letter about his trash cans being visible for a few hours too long after pickup. A sideways glance from a board member when his kids set up a lemonade stand that violated community rules. These were nuisances, yes, but minor enough that Daniel let them slide. After all, why stir trouble in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to value peace? Still, those moments gnawed at him. He began to notice the way the HOA board carried themselves, less like volunteers keeping things tidy and more like gatekeepers with a taste for control. Their rules weren't just about protecting property values, they were about power. And while Daniel had no idea just how far that power could stretch, he was about to find out. Because soon, a small decision, one he thought was harmless, would place him squarely in the crosshairs of the HOA. And once that line was crossed, there would be no going back.
For months, Daniel's life rolled on in rhythm with the neighborhood. Quiet mornings, evenings filled with the sound of children playing, and the reassuring comfort of routine. But the first real tremor came in the form of a thin white envelope taped to his front door. It wasn't a neighbor's note or a flyer. It was an official notice, stamped with the HOA's emblem at the top. Inside, the message was short but sharp. Violation. Lawn maintenance required. Daniel frowned. His lawn was freshly cut, neatly edged, and even greener than most of the houses on his street. He prided himself on it. But according to the notice, the height of grass exceeded the approved standard. Approved standard? That was a phrase he'd never heard before. He chalked it up to an overzealous board member, shook his head, and went about his day. But a week later, another notice appeared, this time about his mailbox paint being slightly faded. The week after that, it was his trash cans improperly stored because they were visible for a single afternoon. Each letter carried not just words, but a fine. $25 here, $50 there. Small amounts at first, but enough to sting. Daniel paid the first fine, hoping it would end the nonsense, but that was just the beginning. Soon, it felt like every corner of his life was under surveillance. His kids left their bikes in the driveway overnight, another violation. A package sat on his porch too long, warning issued. Even the color of his seasonal flowers, cheerful marigolds his wife planted, was flagged as not within community guidelines. Each letter carried the same cold phrasing: failure to comply may result in further fines or legal action. It wasn't just annoying, it was suffocating. At first, Daniel tried reasoning with the board. He sent emails asking for clarification for specific rules. Weeks passed without answers. When he attended the monthly HOA meeting hoping to clear the air, he was met with tight smiles and vague responses. The board president, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice like ice, dismissed his concerns outright. The rules are there for everyone, and it's your responsibility to follow them. It became clear that this wasn't about rules, it was about control. Daniel started noticing a pattern. While his home was scrutinized, others got away with far worse. The neighbor down the street left broken down cars in his driveway for weeks without a single fine. Another had weeds sprouting up waist high, untouched by HOA notices. Why was Daniel singled out? He had a suspicion, and it only grew when he remembered the earlier warnings about his kid's lemonade stand and the board members' disapproving glare. Maybe he and his family weren't the type they wanted in their pristine little kingdom. And then came the spark that set everything ablaze. Daniel had installed a small garden bed near the edge of his lawn. It wasn't extravagant, just a few rows of vegetables, something his kids loved tending to. It gave them joy, a project that brought the family together. But within days, another envelope arrived. Unapproved modification to front yard landscaping. Remove immediately or face escalating fines. Daniel stared at the paper, fury rising in his chest. The garden wasn't hurting anyone. If anything, it made the yard more vibrant, more alive. Yet the board demanded it be destroyed. This time he refused. He ignored the letter. Then came the second notice, then the third. The fines climbed from $100 to $200 to $500. Threats of legal action appeared in bold. Neighbors began whispering. Some avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of getting caught in the crossfire. The HOA wasn't just policing his yard, it was isolating him. Daniel's mailbox overflowed with notices, calls from the HOA's compliance officer, each one sterner than the last. His property was labeled non-compliant in the community newsletter, a public shaming disguised as transparency. And with every attack, the walls of his own home felt smaller, tighter. His frustration bled into sleepless nights, into tense dinners where his wife asked if they should just give in. But Daniel couldn't. It wasn't about flowers or grass anymore. It was about dignity, about being told, day after day, that his home wasn't truly his. One evening as he sat on his porch, staring at the tire tracks that had begun appearing across his lawn, deep, ugly scars cutting through the grass, he realized this wasn't just the HOA anymore. Someone in the neighborhood was making it personal. At first, the tracks appeared once, then twice. Soon, almost every morning, Daniel would step outside to find fresh damage. Whoever it was, they were bold, driving across his property as if it were nothing more than an empty lot. He suspected it might be one of the board members, someone trying to break his resolve, but without proof, he couldn't confront them. And still, the HOA did nothing. When Daniel reported the vandalism, they dismissed it as outside the scope of their authority. Yet the same week, They fined him for a non-uniform mailbox post. It was a trap. Pressure from all sides designed to force him into submission. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man to fold easily. He began keeping records, photos of his lawn, copies of every notice, timestamps of when he filed complaints. He even installed a small camera, hidden among his bushes, hoping to catch whoever was tearing across his property. Nights turned into stockades, his eyes fixed on the darkened street, waiting for the moment when headlights would slice through the silence. And then, one night, it happened. The roar of an engine, the glint of chrome under the streetlights. Daniel's camera captured it all. The same car, the same driver, cutting across his lawn with reckless ease. When he saw who it was, his suspicion turned to certainty. It was someone from the HOA. Heart pounding, he knew this was no longer a matter of petty fines or unapproved flowers. This was a war, and they had made the first move. The question now wasn't whether Daniel could endure it. It was how far he was willing to fight back. Because when the rules are weaponized, when the people meant to protect a community instead use it to torment, there comes a breaking point. And Daniel's was closer than ever.
Daniel had reached the point of no return. For weeks, the footage sat on his computer, replaying like a nightmare he couldn't ignore. The car's headlights slicing through the darkness, the tires grinding across his lawn, the unmistakable outline of the driver, the HOA president herself, the same woman who had smirked at him during board meetings, lectured him about compliance, and buried him in fines. It was undeniable proof that the same person who tormented him on paper was vandalizing his property in the dead of night. But how do you fight someone who thrives on control? How do you bring down a board that twists every rule, silences every objection, and paints you as the villain in your own neighborhood? Daniel knew one thing: quiet resistance hadn't worked. He'd played by their rules, documented every letter, every fine, every false violation, and still they tightened the noose. If he wanted to survive this war, he needed to strike in a way they couldn't ignore. And he needed an audience. The perfect opportunity came in the form of the HOA's annual community meeting, the one event guaranteed to draw nearly every resident. It was supposed to be a cheerful gathering, with snacks on folding tables, neat rows of chairs, and the board sitting proudly at the front like royalty presiding over their subjects. It was also the moment when budgets, rule changes, and fines were presented for the year, a ritual of power disguised as neighborly order. Daniel walked into that meeting carrying a USB drive and a folder thick with papers. His heart hammered like a drum in his chest, but his resolve was steel. At first, the meeting unfolded as it always did: financial reports, maintenance updates, thin smiles, and empty reassurances. The board president sat tall, her voice smooth and commanding as she spoke about the importance of compliance for the good of the community. Her gaze swept the room like a hawk, daring anyone to challenge her. And then Daniel raised his hand. "I have something to share," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to cut through the murmurs. The president frowned, annoyed by the interruption. "This isn't the time for, it's about my property, and it's about this board." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Neighbors turned in their chairs, curious. Some leaned forward, sensing tension. Daniel stepped into the open space, set his folder on the table, and held up the USB drive. "For months, I've been harassed by this board. False violations, unfair fines, and selective enforcement of rules. I've documented everything. But it's not just about letters or money. It's about the fact that while I was accused of non-compliance, my property was being vandalized in the dead of night, and the person responsible is sitting right here." Gasps broke out. The president's face went rigid, her practiced calm cracking at the edges. "You're making serious accusations. This kind of slander—" Daniel didn't let her finish. He walked to the projector set up for the meeting, slid the USB in, and clicked play. The room went silent. On the screen, grainy night vision footage appeared. A car rolled into frame, headlights glaring. It slowed, then swerved deliberately across Daniel's lawn, leaving ruts in the grass. The video froze, and the paused image showed the driver's face illuminated by the dashboard lights. It was her, the president. The silence shattered into chaos. Neighbors gasped, some whispering to one another, others openly glaring at the board. Daniel played the clip again and again until no one in the room could deny what they saw. The very woman who fined him for a faded mailbox, who demanded he destroy his garden, who accused him of violating rules, she was the one defacing his property all along. "This isn't about protecting home values," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the room. "This is about control. It's about bullying. And it's about a board abusing its power to intimidate the very people it's supposed to serve. Well, not anymore, because starting tomorrow, I'll be filing this with an attorney, and I'll make sure their abuse of power sees the inside of a courtroom." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers mixing with angry shouts aimed at the board. The president sat frozen, her empire crumbling in front of her. For the first time in months, Daniel felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't alone, and he wasn't powerless. But as the meeting spiraled into chaos, with neighbors demanding resignations and the board scrambling to salvage their authority, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over, not yet. The legal war ahead would be long and brutal. Still, the turning point had arrived. He had exposed the truth, the neighborhood had seen the rot beneath the surface, and the untouchable board now stood on shaky ground. As Daniel walked out of the community center that night, the cool air hit his face like freedom. Neighbors stopped him on the way out, patting his shoulder, whispering thanks and promising their support. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt hope. But in the shadows of the parking lot, he noticed the president watching him from her car, her eyes burning with fury. She wasn't finished, and neither was he. Because while this night gave him victory, the real war, the one that would decide the future of his home and his family, was still ahead. And Daniel was ready.
In the weeks that followed the explosive community meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with a tension that refused to fade. The once feared HOA board was fractured, their polished authority shattered by the truth on that projector screen. Residents who had stayed silent for years began to speak out, filing their own complaints, digging up their own paper trails of unfair fines and ignored concerns. The board's foundation of intimidation crumbled, piece by piece. Daniel's case didn't end in that meeting hall. True to his word, he brought everything to an attorney. With the video evidence, the documented harassment, and the public humiliation of the president, the HOA had no choice but to settle quickly. Several board members resigned, the president herself was removed, and new elections were called. For the first time, the neighborhood had a chance to choose leadership that actually represented them, not ruled over them. The fines levied against Daniel were erased. The so-called violations were struck from record, and the small garden that had sparked so much outrage, it remained, thriving in the sunlight, a quiet but powerful symbol of his victory. The tire marks on his lawn eventually healed, but the memory of those nights never fully faded. Instead, they became a reminder of what can happen when power goes unchecked and when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. Life slowly returned to normal, though not quite the same as before. Neighbors who once kept their distance now stopped to chat, grateful that Daniel had exposed what they were too afraid to confront. The community grew closer, united by the shared realization that they had been living under the shadow of fear, and that it only took one person standing up to change everything. As for Daniel, he didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a homeowner who wanted peace, who wanted to protect his family and his home. But his fight had rippled outward, proving that sometimes the most ordinary battles, over lawns, mailboxes, or garden beds, revealed the most extraordinary truths about fairness, dignity, and courage. The HOA would never be the same, and neither would he. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a lawn, or about fines, or even about revenge. It was about reclaiming control when others try to strip it away. It was about showing that when people unite against abuse, the balance of power shifts. So, the next time someone tells you rules are rules, ask yourself who's really writing them and who benefits when you stay silent. Sometimes the only way to protect your home isn't by following every rule, but by knowing when to fight back.